So we've talked about economic nationalism and we've talked about economic liberalism as theories and perspectives on the global economy, but we haven't talked a whole lot about Marxist theory. And there's a whole bunch of strains of Marxist thinking that take a very different view of the global economy and see it not as an environment in which there's competition, right? That's one of the things that both economic nationalism and economic liberalism share, is that they view the global system as one in which there's competition. Marxism and Marxist variants tend not to see that competition as the central feature of the global economy. Instead, what they see is cooperation. They see wealthy states working together to create an exploitive system. And if you want to understand the operation of a global system, you need to understand cooperation and you need to understand exploitation. And I should point out that there's a whole wide variety of different perspectives on Marxist perspectives on the global economy, everything from Marx's writings that were then sort of adapted by Lenin to theories of world systems theory, and then economic structuralism. Both are different variants and different research traditions that are all centered on the same basic idea that the system is fundamentally exploitive. But all Marxist theories tend to view the world as divided between these sort of two economic ends, right? On one end, you have the wealthy countries, what we might call the core countries. These are the industrial core. These are the manufacturing bases and technology and industrial sectors of the global economy. This is your capital-intensive parts of the global economy. That's one end of the global economy. And then there's the periphery, the sort of labor-intensive, capital-poor areas that are primarily going to be producing commodities and raw materials and very simple finished goods. And there's a semi-periphery that we could talk about. These are countries that are maybe they appear to be on that transition process to industrialization. Maybe they're involved in the global supply chain in some way, but they're just not quite at that sort of central part of the industrial core of the global economy. And various different Marxist theories will discuss how these different actors interact and how they engage, but they tend to view that engagement as one in which wealthy countries want to make sure that the price of finished goods, of raw materials that are being produced by the periphery, that those prices stay low so that you have access to what you want at a good price, and that markets remain open for the finished goods, the products that core countries are producing, and core countries will work together to ensure that that's what they get. And we'll talk about that quite a bit when we talk about colonialism, and we'll see some of those patterns that have played out over history that I think maybe give a little bit of credence to this idea from the Marxist perspective. The wealthy countries do seem to be working toward this set of ends. We could also adapt this sort of core periphery idea a step further, and I tend to find the story by Johann Galtung about a structural theory of imperialism to be a useful way of thinking about how the center and the periphery can interact. And Galtung talks about not just sort of the global center, the global core, and the global periphery, which I guess are represented by these two different circles. He says within every country, there's also a division between the rich and the poor, those with capital and those without capital, those who rely upon their labor. And he says the only difference really between rich countries and poor countries is that in rich countries you have a larger chunk of the population that's part of that capitalist industrial class. And in poor countries, they're more labor intensive or labor abundant. And so there's a larger chunk of the population that's in the periphery class. And then he talks about the harmony and disharmony of interests. And so one of the things he says is that in every country, there's a disharmony of interests between the rich and the poor, between those who control capital and those who are working for a living, and they want different policies. They want to see different rules in place. They want different things from the global economy. We've talked about this with monetary policy, right? The idea that if you are a banker, you want interest rates to be high because that gives you a better return on your investment. But if you don't have a lot of money in the bank, if all you do is work, you might want to have interest rates be low to kind of push unemployment down, possibly push wages up, that you would have a different set of goals that you would want from economic policy. So that's the idea of a disharmony of interest. So Galtung sees a disharmony of interest within countries between the rich and the poor. And he also sees a disharmony of interest between workers in the core, the center, and workers in the periphery, and a harmony of interest between the wealthy in the core, the center, and the wealthy in the periphery. So the solid line is representing that harmony of interest. And what does that mean? That harmony of interest, disharmony of interest. I would illustrate this with sort of a metaphorical example or a hypothetical scenario that's actually quite accurate. So every year in Davos, Switzerland, the movers and shakers of the global economy come together for the World Economic Forum, in which basically everybody in the shaded areas of the circles gets together in one place and talks about what they want to happen in the global economy in the coming year. And so if you are a factory owner in, let's say, Iowa, and you manufacture shoes in your small factory in Iowa, and you go to Davos, you might pay to go to different receptions. And at one of these receptions, you might run into a guy in a uniform from China, and you're making conversation as you eat, I don't know, little pineapple, cherry, ham hors d'oeuvres, and you say, oh, I'm a factory owner in Iowa, and this general says, oh, I'm a factory owner in China. And you say, really? You're a factory owner in China, but you're an officer. And the general says, yes, of course. Did you not know that 1/3 of all factories in China are owned by the Chinese military? You said, no, I had no idea. And the general says, yes. And so you say, so why are you here in Davos? And the guy says, well, we're looking to expand shoe production. And so you sit down and you pencil out some figures, and you just can discover that you can manufacture shoes for a heck of a lot cheaper in China than you could possibly manufacture them in your factory in Iowa. And so you go back home and you shut your factory down in Iowa and you ship production to China, and the shoes come in and you sell through your regular distribution channels, and you're making money and the general's making money and your workers are out of a job. And when they come to you and say, how could you do this? How could you shut this factory down? We were productive, we were successful, we were doing great work. You would say, it's not you. Right? You all are great. I have no beef with you. It's those workers in China. We're in a global economy, and they will work for so little, and therefore we have no choice but to compete. That's why I had to shut this factory down. Workers in China. Right? That's the disharmony of interest. It's not me, the industrialist, who's shutting your factory down. It's those workers in China. Blame them. And people do. But the same thing is happening in China. That general who runs the factory is telling workers in his factory in China, don't you dare unionize. The only reason there are jobs here at all is because labor is cheap. And if you start wanting health and safety, if you start wanting weekends off, if you start wanting reasonable working conditions, right, that's going to raise the cost of production, and this factory will shut down so fast, and it will head back to the United States, and those American workers will take your jobs. And so this global system has American workers and Chinese workers sort of glaring at each other, thinking that they're in competition with each other, when really what's happening is that the industrialists in the United States and the industrialists in China are sort of working together to make a system in which they are in competition for the benefit of the industrialists in both countries. And so this is what Galtung is arguing is sort of the core dynamic in the global economy. Now, this is a really pessimistic view of the global economy. It's not what I would call conspiracy theory, because it's happening out in the open. Literally, the Davos is covered every year by the international news because it's such a big deal. But that's where these kind of relationships get set up, where you get a harmony of interest between the industrial wealthy capitalist class that oftentimes structures the global economy in a way that workers find frustrating or exploitive.